Hello, and thank you for joining us today on Workforce Institute Radio. I'm Joyce Maloney, Director of the Workforce Institute at Kronos. We'll be chatting today with William Tincup, Workforce Institute board member and principal analyst at Key Interval Research, about a recently published report that he and his partner John Sumster did on the ideal tech-vendor relationship. In short, the research examines the relationship between HR enterprise software vendors like Kronos and their customers, the HR practitioner. The findings paint a picture of how HR and technology relationship is working today and outline some best practices used by those who have seemingly found the secret sauce. So, William, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Joyce. Happy to be here.
Great. So why don't we start off with you providing a brief overview of the report that you just published, including what prompted Key Interval to examine the HR tech vendor relationship.
Sure. So the report starts off with a pocket guide, kind of a summary of the findings, if you will. I mean, who has time to read 70 pages of dense content? My kid, of course. Then we move into discoveries. Think of Lewis and Clark. Imagine a report that they gave once they got back from their adventure. Discoveries can be both good and bad, as you know. But these are things that we discovered along the way, and we tend to render them as factoids and myths. Then we move the reader to findings. These are based on data and what the data told us, and they carry context and action with them. My favorite section is case studies, where we actually get 5 practitioner case studies, real practitioners doing real innovative work, and we help tell their story. We help enable kind of getting their story out in front of a group. Then we move the reader to notables, which is our attempt to not basically play God and say, here are the vendors that you should be working with. We're trying to get at letting vendors tell us who they think is doing a great job. And it's a different vista, and it's a different perspective. And I don't think we have it quite right. I think it'll take us a couple whacks of getting notables right. But the sentiment is, let's go find out what because Insider Baseball and all the people that follow HR Tech every single day, they've got a perspective on the world. And practitioners don't have the exact same they don't have the same vista or view of the technology landscape. And so our bid on notables is basically asking them questions like who's great at implementations, and letting them drive the train. And again, no pick box, no pick list, no searchable technology. They have to type in the names of companies. And so that's kind of an interesting social experiment more than anything else. And so it's different. Notables is different. Again, it's not kind of a vendor landscape or a magic quadrant per se. It's really allowing practitioners to tell their view of the world. What prompted all this research is it's 2 things. At the end of the day, it's curiosity. John and I are really curious as to what really happens behind the HR veil. And second to that is a belief at this noise level, 500 HR and recruiting bloggers out there, the media portrayal of HR, and vendor marketing, i.e. the 22,000 software firms that play in HCM, they're all content marketers. There's a considerable noise level, or at least there's a belief that there's a considerable noise level that's not a true rendering of the practitioner experience. And so why did we even start Key Interval? Why did we create a research agenda? Why did we do this report? It kind of all tracks back to we're really curious, and we have this belief that the portrayal of HR is not an accurate portrayal of HR.
So in this report, you're exploring what makes for a good or not so good relationship between an HR tech vendor and their customer. So overall, thinking about the headlines from your report, how surprised were you by your findings, or what specifically might have surprised you?
3 things come to mind. We asked the question, is your software crummy? And 78% of the respondents said no. And that's not what we hear when we attend conferences. In fact, if you listen to only vendors, you'd think that great software was never created unless it's by them. So you get this feel like all the software, the recruiting software, sourcing software, succession, performance, all terrible. It's terrible software. But when you actually talk to practitioners and get their view on it, they're pretty happy with their software. It's not as terrible as people would lead us to believe. So that threw us. That we were shocked about. Then we asked the question, does your HR software deliver what the vendor promised? And again, overwhelming response said yes, it does. And again, if we only listen to the HR insiders, we'd be led to believe that all software salespeople lie and all software firms don't support their customers. But in fact, the reality is that that happens rarely. And so we were floored by that because it wasn't we went into it with bias, and we talked about the bias in the report. And so we were floored when we found out that our bias was wrong because of who we're listening to and what and why and where and all that stuff. Lastly, we asked the question of what's the most important implementation metric, and the answer absolutely floored John and I. It was overwhelmingly user satisfaction. Now, practitioners go about it in a very kind of a low-tech, low-brow way. They ask users. So let's say we're going through a Kronos implementation. They would ask people, hey, how's Kronos going? How's that going for you? You like it? You love it? You hate it? Does it make your life better? Is it, what's the bit? And that's the responses. It's not analytics. It's not a survey. It's not rolled up and sophisticated. But the fact that they actually care about user satisfaction is something that is so take Google user satisfaction, HCM, and there isn't a single vendor in the world talking about user satisfaction. Well, yet it's something practitioners actually care about. And it also kind of threw us into an area that there's something beyond adoption. Like we've been talking about adoption for a decade. How do you get people to consume the software, use the software, adopt the software? But there's something beyond adoption. And what's beyond it is how do you create an environment where users love the software that they use? So it's assumptive that they're using it because they love it. They're happy. It's made their life better. It's made a more engaged employee. Like, we would have never unlocked that door. We would have never thought that thought had it not been for talking to practitioners.
Yeah, I've had a chance to look at some of the research highlights, and I would have to say that, the things you've just mentioned were notable to me too, especially how high a proportion of folks don't feel that their software is crummy, and maybe part of that is people becoming hostages as opposed to advocates. Like I did all this work to get this thing into my organization, and now I'm going to make it work. But I do think making it work, a huge part of that is that the community that it's intended for isn't at your door with, heads on spikes. So I am surprised it's the most important implementation success metric, but I'm not surprised that it's on your list. So you and John have come up with a software lifecycle model that has 8 elements in it, and so maybe it'd be helpful if you could summarize what those elements are and explain the role that each of those plays in making for a great HR technology vendor relationship.
Sure. So years ago I created kind of a satisfaction model where it was a 7-pointed star, and that satisfaction existed on many levels and in many places where someone could be happy with product yet very unhappy with sales. And so it's kind of a simplistic model. And when John and I were looking at how we carve up this research and how do we ask people about these things, we said, you know what, there's 8 elements, and the evaluation, administration, implementation, training, adoption, operations, IE support, overall relationship, and product. And I'll kind of give a brief description of those. But basically, it's if you think of it as a practitioner and a vendor can have and do have many relationships. It's not one-dimensional. It's not one way where it's just the product and nothing else. They can absolutely love the product and not like some of the elements, or love everything. And so evaluation is kind of the period that the organization is considering alternative HR software solution. That's what kind of we call the evaluation, like what are they doing in that period where they're looking at other stuff. Administration is any activity that's not directly related to the work performed in the software. So it's all the stuff outside of the software. Ironically, it's the stuff that practitioners value the most and software vendors in general devalue. So you got a weird relationship in administration where software vendors would like for it just to be a game about software, and practitioners, again, you got to have good software, but they care about everything that happens outside of the software, probably to the tune of just as much, if not more, than the software. Implementation is pretty simple. It's the process in which getting the software installed and activated and tailored to the organization's needs. Training includes all the activities to get users to use the software. Adoption, the degree in which people consume, use, and adopt the software. So if you have 80 people that are supposed to be using the software and you only get 60, then that's an adoption percentage. And so that's adoption. Operations is the ongoing usage and maintenance of the software, just as important. Overall relationship is it's the everything encompassed is the overall relationship. Everything builds up to that. And last, probably most important on some levels, is product. Refers to the software and what data is required to make it work.
Okay. So in your research, despite the fact that most HR practitioners indicated they were satisfied with their vendor relationships, 60% of organizations you spoke with say they have terminated an HR technology vendor for cause. So in those conversations, what did you find to be the main drivers that caused those relationships to end?
You will laugh because you've been doing this a long time, both Kronos and before. It's simple. Vendors get fired, or worse than that, not renewed for two reasons: bad relationship, or their software doesn't do what it promised. So that at the end of the day, there's a relationship deficit, that there's a treatment of people somewhere in that ecosystem, support, sales, their implementation team, think of all the people that touch the customer. Somewhere was massive failure, a bad relationship, or we promised something in the sales process about the technology, and we didn't deliver it. And fired's a weird word. It's like I look at that word and I think of what's our regrettable churn. Customers leave us. Like that's what happens. Some people get into bankruptcy and they can't afford it, and so that they technically left, but there was nothing you could do to save that relationship. But it's the people that choose to do business with someone else that we wanted to do business with, that regrettable churn. Two things drive those folks to leave. And it's bad relationships somewhere in our ecosystem that touched the customer, or the software didn't do what we promised it.
Yeah, and I think on both of those fronts, things have to get pretty bad to make us leave, because you do invest a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in software implementations. And to your point, getting software installed and deployed is really the least of your issues. All the other things that you talked about in terms of really getting the solution embedded in an organization in a way that people are going to use it, the way you intend for them to use it, and then it's going to deliver the insight or the process management or whatever that you bought it for in the first place. And I think everybody goes into these relationships right after they've made a purchase decision thinking, wow, this is a brave new world. And then the brave new world, just turns into this unremitting swamp. And if somebody isn't there to, stick out their hand and guide you along to that better place, and doing it in a way that's thoughtful and that says, hey, I can be your guide here. I've done this before. I'm going to help you get there. And sometimes I think, and certainly in my own experience with software companies, that vendors feel like what the practitioners want is this wide open prairie of, just tell us how you want it to be and we'll make it that way. Whereas often what we find is that our customers are saying, hey, you've done this hundreds, if not thousands of times before. We expect you to be our guide, not stick us on the boat and shove us off into the wide open ocean.
Yeah, and you take that to the extreme. So I worked for Sam Walton for 5 years of my life. And at one point, he taught me a lesson. I mean, literally, it's him and I on our hardware aisle. And he tells me a story. He goes, Will, here's the thing. Let's say you're at a Kmart, and you see that they have wood handle hammers. And a customer comes in, and just let's say you haven't ordered them, and you're out of stock. You've got all the other hammers, but you don't have a wood handle hammer. And a customer comes up and asks you, hey, I'd like to get a wood handle hammer. You have he goes on, he says, you have a moral obligation to tell them that you don't have them and that you saw them at a Kmart that weekend and that the Kmart's right down the street, and if that's what they want, they should go down there and get that and then come back and see you for other stuff. And I was like 17 at the time. I have no idea what the hell he was talking about. But that's the end in which practitioners want vendors to interact with them. They want them to tell them things that might not even be in their interest, counter to their interest sometimes. That's how you build trust. And that's more important than any features that are on the roadmap. It's that trust. And so how do you do that? How do you enable that across all of the organization? I think that's the game. I think that's harder to do than all the other stuff that's structural around software.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think that's the foundation that lets you, stumble and get back on your feet over time in a relationship between a vendor and a customer, because it's software. There's going to be the software. There's going to be bugs, or the report's not going to execute the way you expect, or whatever it is. And as long as the vendor is willing to say, look, yeah, we messed up here, and we're going to make it right for you, but you have to have that ongoing belief that when they make a mistake, they're going to make it right. So I'm not going to panic when they make a mistake, because I have a history of knowing that they have my best long-range interests.
And that cuts both, you're right, absolutely right, that cuts both ways. Because that's both the vendor making mistakes and missing deadlines, and that's practitioners doing the same thing. So that's they make mistakes just as much as we do. So they say their data's perfect. We want to then find out their data's not perfect. They miss meetings. They miss deadlines. Like they go through churn internally. Like all of that stuff is just as true on the practitioner side as it is on the vendor side. And at the end of the day, do you have that person's back, and do they have your back? And how do you create that relationship where you're both vulnerable, yet at the end of the day you're going to take care of each other?
Yeah, and it's performance on both sides, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you also say in the report that only a tiny fraction of vendors and HR practitioners are producing, and I'll quote you, extraordinary levels of excellence in return. So in terms of that statement or that observation, were there any common threads that set those extraordinary relationships apart from the rest?
Yeah, it's by the way, let me close the loop on the Sam Walton story. He then went on to say, now order wood hammers. Never be out of stock of wood handled hammers ever again in your lifetime. So there was, yet another moral to that story. It is kind of a men are from Mars, women are from Venus story. Software vendors tend to care about the software. Practitioners care about everything other than the software, i.e. the relationship. So one of the things to activate this is to align the interest. So Ben Franklin 101, how do you align the individual interest with the community interest? And in this case, how do you get the practitioner's interest and the vendor's interest to be very similar? And how do you create that alignment? So some of the things we're seeing, some vendors are creating training for free, which helps software adoption, which helps the relationship and software consumption. So they're It's free. Heck, the concept of free, they're bundling the price of some of that cost back into the licensing things. They're not going poor, but they're not creating a profit center out of it either. So they're finding a way of saying, listen, if we have training separate, you're going to gut it, and that's going to create a problem because we're not going to get the adoption, which actually hurts both of us. So how do we align our interests in a way of saying, no, we're going to get you training. No, training's not an issue. We're going to train the heck out of you because if you use this software, then you're going to get the value and our interests are aligned. Some vendors are getting past go live, getting paid past go live. So they're basically, you have different models of SaaS would say the contract starts today, we start getting paid today. You're starting to see more and more contracts where the contract essentially, the payment cycle starts at go live. So there's a definition of go live. There's a shared, definition and understanding and experience around go live. Go live happens, and then there's the payments that then flow after that, which creates less anxiety for the practitioner. There's probably more anxiety for the vendor, but it's a way of saying, listen, we're going to share in this, we're going to get to this place, and then we're going to start to get paid, but it's after you're in the software, you're using it, and value's being created, not a moment before that. So we're seeing some more of that type of stuff. But we're also seeing vendors, especially that use a third party to implement, use a mixture of NPS, user satisfaction, and go live to determine bonus structure. So when you have a third party implementing, sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes their interest, a consultant's interest, is different than a software company's and is different than a practitioner. And sometimes, a lot of the times that works out. But we're starting to see models where they say, you know what, at the end of the day, we want people to be really happy. We want users to be using and happy. And we want Go Live to be protected as a sacred place, not something to be stretched out over a long period of time. And that aligns everyone's interest. And so we're seeing models. So, long story short, how do you pull the interest of the vendor and the practitioner together to where they're almost overlaid perfectly?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, it's an interesting concept, and it also, since part of my responsibility at Kronos is our Voice of the Customer program, and customer loyalty is one of the things that we measure, it also strikes me that the only way that you get the employees in your firm to line up their behavior with the interests of your customers is to make the connection between, explicitly make the connection between their efforts and the impact those efforts have on customers. And you used the example before of engineers, and engineers believe it's all about the product. And several years ago, I was working with a vendor whose software we use, and we were going through a particularly bad patch, and the chief technology officer of the company said, would you come in and talk to my engineering leadership team and share with them not just the facts and figures about what's working and what's not working, but explain to them exactly the way this impacts you in your job, in your day job. And I went and spoke to these folks who were all smart, senior level engineering, team leads and directors. But I talked to them about the personal cost in terms of embarrassment or not being able to meet my commitments because of failures of their product. And you could see light bulbs going off. And I thought it was, at the time, I thought it was kind of like a strange request from this chief technology officer. But when I saw the impact on these people, like, wow, I never really thought about the fact that this bug could actually lead somebody to be losing sleep because they're concerned that their reputation within their organization is suffering. And it was it was a very productive conversation going both ways. Who knows, maybe 3 minutes after I walked out of the room, they forgot all about it. But it really struck me in that moment, these folks actually don't know what it means when the software doesn't perform the way it's supposed to.
Joyce, you are spot on, and that happens every single day in HR. So all the different flavors of HR, compensation, training, recruiting, you interact with a lot of those folks. Every single one of them have equity they have their own equity tied up into these selections. And at the end of the day, those selections either make them look like stars, like rock stars, and make them look great, or they don't. And some of these are career-ending decisions that people make. And so, so much of, when you listen to a lot of the insiders, you get a lot of the software stuff. But if you step away from that kind of rhetoric, you find out that the people on the other end, they have a lot of feelings and they want it to be successful. They absolutely would. They'll do whatever it takes to be successful, because they've got a lot personally riding on the purchases that they make.
Yep, exactly. So, William, if people are interested in seeing the full results of your report, how can they acquire that?
Turns out it's for sale. Just kidding. Go to Key Interval, the website, keyinterval.com, and the report's there. You can read about it. But also, if you're just really curious, email me at william@keyinterval.com, and I'll figure out a way to get something to you, because, there's nothing worse than a report that goes unread.
Exactly. Well, William, thanks so much for joining me today. We always have good conversations, and glad to be able to share this one with the bigger world. And for those of you who do listen to this podcast, thanks for doing so. I encourage you to visit us on the web at workforceinstitute.org, where you can join the conversation by adding your comments to our discussion. Thanks for listening.